Ontario Debate 99. Now, moderator Ann Medina.
Good evening and welcome to Debate 99 with the leaders of Ontario's major political parties. And they are, from your left, Howard Hampton, leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party; Premier Mike Harris, leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party; and Dalton McGuinty, leader of the official opposition and the Ontario Liberal Party. Tonight's debate is jointly produced by the CBC, CTV, Global Television, On TV, and City TV. The debate will be divided into three broad issue areas: healthcare, education, and the economy. Each segment will begin with a videotaped question chosen from hundreds of letters sent in by you, the voters. Each leader will then have 1 minute to respond, and then a journalist will follow up with a question to a pre-selected leader who will also have 1 minute. At that point, the subject will be open to a three-way debate. Our panel of journalists include Ken Shaw of CTV, Suhana Marchand of CBC News, Colin Vaughan of City TV, Jennifer Mossop of On TV, and Robert Fisher of Global TV. About my role, all three parties have agreed that the debating sections would be better served if we removed the straitjacket of equal time. I have been asked, however, to intervene in two situations. First, if a leader has been trying for a, quote, lengthy period of time to make a point and has been unable to do so. And second, I will step in if the debate turns into an unproductive open argument in which none of the leaders can be understood. Finally, I might mention that each of the leaders clearly can see a red light signifying time's up. So whenever the leaders are given a time limit, it's hoped that they'll honor it, because I hate to interrupt. And now let's begin by going to our first question from a voter on the theme of health care.
Hi, I'm Christine Burton. I work and live in Ajax here, and my question for the leaders of the leaders is for medical care. I want to know why this hospital, the 2 floors are closed, the 2 top floors, and we only have 1 hospital here in Pickering and Ajax, and that concerns me because if there's anybody that needs extra special care, they have to go to Toronto and look at all the hospitals in Toronto to see if they can get the medical attention they need. And I don't see the reason for that. There should be medical care out here for us people in Ajax and in Pickering.
The parties have drawn lots for tonight's speaking orders in all the segments. The first leader to respond now will be Howard Hampton.
Thank you, and I want to thank the viewers for welcoming us into their homes tonight. In every community I visited, every person that I've talked to over the last 2 weeks, people are very concerned about the state of the healthcare system. People can't get the home care they need when we need it. Too many people have been left waiting in emergency rooms. Why is this happening? It's happening because every day the Mike Harris government takes $4.1 million out of hospitals, out of health care, and other services to finance an income tax cut that only benefits the wealthiest people in the province. Now, Mr. McGuinty agrees with me that cuts have been made to finance an income tax cut, but he won't do anything about it. We must restore health care. We must make those investments. Only New Democrats are prepared to roll back the top end of Mike Harris's tax cut, which gives most of the money to the 6% who are the wealthiest. We'll put that money back into our hospitals, the healthcare system, and our communities to do the most good for the most people.
Thank you. Mike Harris.
Well, thank you very much, Christine, for the question. You're right. There are some empty wings. There are, as you say, 2 top floors in your hospital, Christine. This happened because over the 10-year period before we were elected, 10,000 beds were closed across the province. This is equivalent to 33 entire hospitals were shut down. This was presumably to save money, and it was also as needs changed and more people were getting care in the community. At least that was the theory. And that's what we inherited. And that's why, with our goal of high-quality, dependable health care, we set about listening to the experts over which hospitals should we expand, which new wings should we build. And in the Ajax Pickering area where you live, of course, as a growth area, there will be new hospitals built, there'll be new wings built, and there'll be care provided as close to home as possible.
Thank you, Dalton McGuinty.
Thank you, Christine, for your question. I think it's important for viewers to remember that 4 years ago, Mike Harris made a promise that he would cut our taxes without compromising our health care and our education. The fact of the matter is that he has compromised both. And the thing that I hear over and over and over again as I travel our province is people are telling me, make sure that I have health care that I can count on. That's exactly what I intend to do. I will invest $728 million more in health care than will Mike Harris. I will put our hospitals before another tax cut. And I want to ensure that Ontarians everywhere have access to quality health care in their community. And will introduce new standards guaranteed by law. For example, if you show up at an emergency ward, you'll be assessed within 15 minutes and you'll be guaranteed a bed if you have to spend the night in a hospital.
Thank you, and we now turn to the first of the questions from the journalists following the same theme established by the voters' question. One of the leaders will have a minute to respond before the red light comes on, signaling his time is up and the debate can begin. The lights will also warn the leaders when the debate is over. For the first question, Suhana Marchand of CBC News.
Thank you, Ann. Good evening from the panel, gentlemen. My question is to Mike Harris. Mr. Harris, you've consistently said you've had to make tough decisions as Premier. Thousands of nurses were laid off or left their jobs out of frustration because of one of your tough decisions, hospital budget cuts. Now you tell us you will hire 12,000 new nurses. What does that say, Mr. Harris, about your tough decisions?
Well, they were difficult decisions, Suhana, but let me set the record straight. Here's an independent study done by McMaster University and University of Toronto that says those facts aren't quite correct. The study says the number of nurses declined by about 1,200 between 95 and 97. The independent study by the Canadian Institute for Health Information shows that 6,200 nurses left before we took office under previous administrations. It also shows that we slowed the trend, stopped it, and in 1998, last year, throughout, close to 1,000 new nurses were hired across the province of Ontario. And now, after setting up a nursing task force, we are hiring 12,000 new nurses, as they suggested, would be required across the province. We need them in acute care hospitals, we need them in chronic care hospitals, we need them in nursing homes, and we need them in the community. And we have responded to the challenges that we inherited. First, we reversed the trend, then we started hiring.
Gentlemen, the debate
Surely, Mr.
begins.
Harris, you are not going to deny that your cuts to hospitals have led to layoffs of thousands of nurses throughout the province of Ontario. And you can quote your studies and cite your documents. But if you were to remove yourself from the bubble and go into hospitals and talk to patients and talk to nurses and gain an intimate understanding of what's happening inside our healthcare system today, you will understand that people are spending nights in hospital corridors, people are backed up in emergency wards because of your cuts to our hospitals.
Mr. Harris, you've cut $800 million from the hospital system, and your Minister of Health acknowledges that. And hospitals, in turn, took those cuts and were forced to lay off nurses. Everyone knows that at least 75% of the budget of hospitals goes towards paying for the nurses, the registered practical nurses, and the other healthcare providers in the hospital. And that's what hospitals did when they were faced with an across-the-board $800 million cut, and then other things that they had to absorb besides. They laid off nurses. And Mr. Harris, you can produce all the studies you want. I've met people who've fallen through the cracks in your healthcare system. I met Karen Ford, who can't get the cancer treatment when she needs it. And I think it behooves you now to admit to people, you made those cuts, you made them in a clumsy and awkward way, and frankly, you made them in an uncaring way to support your income tax cuts.
Well, let's be clear about what we did do. We did ask all government agencies to try and cut out the waste, to try and do more for less. We acknowledge that. But the studies are independent studies, and they clearly show most of the nurses were let go before we took office. They clearly show we reversed that trend. They clearly show that we're now hiring new nurses, and that is what is important. And you know what? I know the union leaders are telling you, Dalton, that things could be better, or Harris is to blame. But let me to give you some quotes from real nurses, because I do go to hospitals and I do meet with nurses. Here's Mary Ellen Jeans. She's the executive director of the Canadian Nurses Association. I'd like to congratulate your government for making a commitment towards reinvesting in registered nurses. Irene Crees, executive director of the Timmins and District Hospital. I think it's good news for healthcare. So I don't want to minimize the problems. I want to acknowledge we have had serious challenges in the healthcare system, and it has not been easy, and there are no simplistic answers, but we didn't run from the challenges. We faced them head on, we consulted the experts, and we are solving problems, and the system is getting better.
You were very short-sighted in making cuts.
People told you were making unwise cuts. People out there in the hospital said to you, please don't do this. This is going to put us in a situation that is untenable. All of you who are watching know that the Harris government has made announcements and then re-announcements and then re-announcements about health care, and yet the money hasn't turned up in our hospitals, in our home care system. It hasn't rehired the nurses. Hospital after hospital out there acknowledges that the announcements have been made and made again, and yet the money hasn't come into the hospitals to rehire those nurses. And that's why people are still falling through the cracks. That's why each and every one of you knows someone who has fallen through the cracks and can't get the health care they need. And it's important to acknowledge where the money went. The money was taken out of health care to finance Mike Harris's income tax cuts. And those income tax cuts haven't benefited ordinary people. They've benefited the most well-off. It was wrong to cut health care to do that, and that's the Mike Harris record.
Let's get away, Mr. Harris. Let's get away from these statistics and talk about practical stories here.
We have put $4.3 billion more into health care. We had to put in $2.8 billion that was cut out of health care by the federal Liberals in Ottawa, and then we put an extra $1.5 billion in. And why were we able to do that? Because our tax cuts produced the strongest economic turnaround, the strong economy, and it gave us the dollars and the resources. There is more money in the healthcare system. That is a fact. There are more nurses now. That is a fact.
Your tax cuts
but are all the problems resolved?
$24 billion in additional
all the
debt.
problems are not resolved. We acknowledge that. This is a tough, complex problem, and it's going to take time to fix it.
Mr. Harris, your tax cuts produced $24 billion in additional debt.
Well,
and if we remove ourselves for a minute from the statistics, if we remove ourselves from a moment from the statistics and the studies and talk about what's happening on the front lines, I'll tell you a specific story. There was an 82-year-old man in Peterborough who went into the hospital in the evening. He had to spend the night on a stretcher because there were no beds available. He was found in the morning by his daughter. He had passed on. The nurses were being run off their feet, and they didn't have time to discover that one of the patients had died. Now that, in and of itself, it seems to me, Mr. Harris, is very telling in terms of what's happened to health care today in Ontario.
Well,
as a direct result of your cuts.
Let me say nobody wants to see a tragedy like that. It is a complicated system. There are no easy answers. It's important to know what we inherited. We inherited a healthcare system in decline, half-closed hospitals, old and decaying hospitals, not one new term long care bed built in 10 years before we took office.
Not true.
So we took the necessary but very difficult but very necessary decisions to revitalize our healthcare system and then start building it up again.
Mr. Harris, that's just not true. The fact of the matter is this. You are investing less in health care today than at any time earlier in the 1990s. When you factor in the aging population, the growing population, and just a simple thing like inflation, and then take out the one-time money that you put in to lay off nurses, you are investing less in health care than ever before, and it shows.
That ends this round, and now we go to our next question from Ken Shaw of CTV. Ken.
Thank you, Ann. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. McGinty, my question is for you, sir. On your web page, you say that you want to reopen Ottawa's Montfort Hospital, and you also say that you want to stop the merger of Toronto's Women's College Hospital and Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. In Sudbury last Tuesday, you said that you were not going to be bound by any decisions of the Health Services Restructuring Commission. In fact, you said that you would revisit all those decisions in its entirety. The Ontario Hospital Association says that they have a problem with that they think that would be a mistake. They said that it will cause a lot of problems on the front line for patients and their families. Why do you want to revisit this question of reopening the hospitals, and why do you think you can do a better job than the Commission did?
Thank you for your question, Ken. First of all, I should make it perfectly clear that I feel my accountability does not lie with hospital administrators, but rather patients in Ontario who are seeking good health care. And one of the things that people should understand about Mike Harris's Hospital Restructuring Commission is that it only took into account our hospital needs through to the year 2003. We intend to revisit all of those decisions to make sure that Ontario patients are having their health care needs met hospital-wise through to the year 2020. It is simply ridiculous to consider to put in place a revised or restructured hospital system for 11 million users that only takes into account our needs through to such a short period of time. I think it's very important and in the interest of Ontario patients that we revisit each and every one of those decisions.
Well, Ken, I don't think, with all due respect, that Dalton answered your question at all. Reviewing or revisiting, those are the kind of buzzwords or weasel words that mean I'm not prepared to tell you now. I'm going to save that until after the election. Reviewing something as important as healthcare after all the studies have been done, after all the experts have had their say, and after all the consultations, simply is not providing the leadership required in this province. Mr. McGinty is playing politics with health care, and I tell you that I believe Ontarians deserve better. And let me tell you the last time I heard the words review or revisit. The last time I heard that was Jean Chrétien. He said, we'll review the GST. We know what those kind of words mean. They are not the kind of words that are being upfront with Ontarians about a serious matter like their health care.
Well, let's talk about what's really happened, Mr. Harris. What your government did is you went out there and you closed hospitals without doing that full inventory of what was needed. And I say this to people in community after community. You know that if you look at the hospital system in your community, hospital services have been cut and shut down, but the replacement services in terms of community health clinics or in home care or in other community delivery hasn't been created. So huge gaps have been created by the Harris government in the healthcare system. Now, Mr. Harris has tried to plug those by inviting in private for-profit corporations to provide American-style healthcare. That is, corporations who deliver healthcare, but for a profit and with a lot of new user fees. Wrong direction to go. We should never copy the American style of healthcare. It's very expensive, and it leaves all kinds of people out. What's needed is a moratorium on further hospital closures, so that at the community level, people can look to see that the services are going to be provided. And if they aren't going to be provided in a good system of home care, a not-for-profit community system of home care, if they're not going to be provided in community health centers, then those services have to be restored to hospitals. Wow. It was wrong to cut hospitals to finance an income tax cut, and that's what's happened. And what's needed now is to put the money back into the system, to roll back the top end of Mr. Harris's income tax cut, put the money back into the system so that we can start to guarantee the kind of Medicare that people need.
My concern now, my concern is what Mr. Harris intends to do in the future now. Because last time Mr. Harris said he wasn't going to close hospitals.
Well, I think I'm entitled to respond.
You said you weren't going to close hospitals.
You said all these hospitals are closing. Very few hospitals have closed. Most will not close for the next 2, 3, 4 years until the new home care services are in place, until the new hospitals in place. Case in point, Women's College, which, by the way, Mr. McGuinty, you supported a bill to have Women's College move to new, improved headquarters, saving money in conjunction with Sunnybrook Hospital. You supported that bill. Mr. Hampton supported that bill. And then in the middle of an election, because there are obviously some challenges in coming together administration, you changed your mind. But the fact of the matter is, Women's College is still open. It will be open on its present location for quite some time until all the services are ready to go in the new facilities. It's the same in North Bay. It's the same in Thunder Bay. It's the same in London. It's the same in Ottawa, all across this
Women's
province.
College cannot fulfill its mandate the way it's set up right now. And you should understand that. It has an important responsibility on behalf of all Ontario women. It simply cannot hang on to its culture, its values, and its distinct way of delivering medicine as long as it's going to be part of a much larger institution. We've got to, whenever we find excellence, Mr. Harris, we should be promoting it, nurturing it, and cherishing it. You're killing it. We should hang on to Women's College Hospital and get the best out of it. That's what Ontario women want us to do, and that's what I intend to do.
Well, that is exactly what we're doing.
You still haven't dealt with the issue. The fact of the matter is, by imposing huge cuts on hospitals, by forcing them to lay off nurses, by forcing them to cut services, and then by closing some hospitals, we do have these huge gaps in the healthcare system. And adopting the American style of for-profit healthcare, which is happening now in home care and long-term care, is not going to solve the problem. And I want to say this to Mr. McGuinty as well. Mr. McGuinty, you agree that cuts have been made to healthcare and hospitals to finance an income tax reduction. But you agree with Mr. Harris that you're not going to bring that money back. And I have to say to you, I know where Mr. Harris lies. He will make more cuts. But I have to say to you, where are you going to find the money for Women's College or for Mall 4 or anything else when you support an income tax system that has taken money out of healthcare, money out of hospitals to finance it?
I appreciate the question. First of all, let's remind viewers of what happened under NDP economics in Ontario. You brought this province to its knees, economically speaking. I have been very, very clear in terms of where we're going to get the money. We found it within the existing provincial budget. We have different priorities. And frankly, I am surprised that you have not been attacking Mr. Harris for spending $100 million on advertising when we could be spending that in health care or in education. And why he's been spending so much money on American consultants.
$100 million from advertising doesn't come close to the almost $2 billion that's been cut from healthcare and hospitals.
There's hundreds of millions.
$100 million of one-time money won't do it, Mr. McGuinty. And as far as you're trying to say, well, we'll find the money elsewhere in the budget, then I think you have to say to people out there, where are you going to make the cuts? Are you going to cut education to fund hospitals? Because reallocation and finding savings means you're going to have to cut somewhere. I've read your document.
Very much.
$900 in cuts have to be made by you.
I believe that's the end of this round. Thank you. And the final question for this segment on health is from Robert Fisher of Global Television. Robert.
Thanks, Ann. Gentlemen, good evening. Mr. Hampton, I think anyone who has been to a hospital emergency ward in their local hospitals often finds that ward in chaos. Though I think it should be said here tonight that nurses and doctors are doing an outstanding job in often very difficult circumstances. You, Mr. McGuinty, and Mr. Harris have promised a so-called patient bill of rights. Included is a guarantee, that's your word, not mine, of medical attention from a trained professional, I'm assuming a nurse here, within 15 minutes. But that's as far as your promise has gone so far. We've heard no specifics from you or, in fact, from Mr. Harris or Mr. McGuinty. So tonight, this is your opportunity to be specific. How can you make such a guarantee? How do you plan to enforce it if a patient is not seen in 15 minutes? And perhaps more importantly for the people out there watching who use emergency wards, if they don't get that service, what's their recourse, legal or otherwise?
Let's start where we are now. The Harris government has put the emphasis not on patient care, but on how much money can be taken out of the healthcare system. And that's been the full emphasis over the last 4 years. What I'm saying in a Patient's Bill of Rights and a Healthcare Accountability Act, what I'm saying we need is, first of all, to ensure that certain quality of service is there. And a healthcare commissioner would work with hospitals, with homes for the aged, to ensure that a certain quality of care is known by everyone and can be met. And that healthcare commissioner would have a job each year to report to the legislature, much as the provincial auditor reports, much as the Environmental Commissioner reports, on whether those standards of care are being met and what is required to meet those standards of care. But what it's really all about is this. It's about putting the emphasis back on patient care, not on how much money can be taken out of the system, not on what can be shut down, not on what can be Americanized and privatized, but on patient care, the quality of patient care, and using a healthcare commissioner just as the environmental commissioner ensures the environment is being respected, ensure that those healthcare standards are being respected.
We've got to move beyond that, and I'm sure that people here would agree. We've got to move beyond simply assessing patients within 15 minutes. And that's why our plan calls for much more than that. It calls for ensuring that patients have access to a bed inside a hospital room if they have to spend the night inside the hospital. In addition, it's time to hire back all of those nurses that Mike Harris fired. We've got the fewest nurses per capita now in the country. I think it's important if you leave your mom at the hospital and at 3:30 in the morning she presses on the buzzer, it's very important that a nurse be available to come to her bedside. And we've got to stop sending our patients south of the border for treatment. We've got to make sure that we can provide radiation treatment at the 4-week mark, as recommended by doctors, instead of at the 3-month mark, as is happening today. Those are commitments that we are making. We'll put the necessary resources into healthcare to make it happen.
Well, listen, we know there have been problems. We know the healthcare system is a very, very complicated, expensive system. Some of you have said we cut funding from the healthcare system. The record shows we made up $2.8 billion that were cut by the federal Liberals out of healthcare. We made that up, plus we made up another $1.5 billion new dollars. But I agree that it is not just money. It is how the money is being spent. And this caring, it's easy to say you care. I wish, you know, after being in the Premier's chair for 4 years, I could tell you that it was so simplistic. Yes, I believe we can, through a report card mechanism that we have proposed, through an annual review. Hospital associations have agreed to be held accountable. There'll be a report card on how well they're doing and are they meeting the standards. And we have said very clearly, if they're meeting or exceeding the standards, those will be the hospitals that we think should get new programs. If they are not, then they have to upgrade themselves.
You've had 4 years to do that, and you haven't done it.
Well, Howard, let me tell you,
what you've done is
you've taken
the money out of healthcare and out of hospitals. And if I may, both you and Mr. McGuinty have a problem. Because I read your so-called budget document last Tuesday, and the only way that Mr. Harris had some money to put into the healthcare cracks and the education cracks is he had to go out and sell Highway 407 for $1.6 billion. Now that's just one-time money. You can only sell a highway once, which means that in this election year, after that money's gone, Mr. Harris has a problem. There's a $1.6 billion gap. Mr. McGuinty, I believe, also has a problem because he insists there's going to be a surplus to put into health care and education. I think what you've done is you've sold a highway to give the appearance that health care is going to be all right. But in fact, look 1 year down the road, there's a huge gap, and that gap has occurred, Mr. Premier, because you're too busy taking money out of health and out of education to finance your tax cut instead of worrying about patient care and the quality of patient care that people need.
The record shows we have put over $4 billion into health care, and we've done that because we have a strong economy. The record shows that tax cuts have not only created 540,000 jobs, they're taxpayers, and they have given us over $6 billion of new revenue since we took office. And I will agree with you on this, Howard, I will agree with you on this, that Mr. McGuinty's plan is short close to $6 billion. That's the amount of spending that he hasn't accounted for. And he's either going to have to hike the deficit or hike taxes to pay for $6 billion in unaccounted for promises. And I'll give you this.
Let me say, Mr. Harris, let me respond to this now.
You at least have acknowledged where your money is going to come from.
Let me respond to this. You know that I have no intention whatsoever. I have no intention whatsoever of raising taxes. And once I've eliminated your deficit, I won't be running any more deficits. But I think what is really important here is for Ontarians to understand that the single most, as they do, the single most pressing issue today in Ontario is health care. And if Mr. Harris has really put that much more money into the system, that is truly an accomplishment to spend that much more money on top of what was being spent in the past and to deliver us worse health care. I mean, Mr. Harris, how could you manage it?
Well, it does show you how serious the problem was. It does show you, even with $1.5 billion, that we have an aging population. We have new technology, that we inherited a system in decline. When you have 10,000 beds closed and still paying for them, even though they're not offering health care services, the equivalent of 33 hospitals, you really have a management problem. And listen, I want to acknowledge that there have been problems. It has not been easy. And I think premiers all across the country have been wrestling with this huge challenge of dealing with health care and the increasing costs of health care. And I might add, we've all been wrestling with it across the country as Ottawa balanced its books by slashing health care funding to the provinces. And I would like to say this, when I went to Ottawa to get more money, when I led the charge with the other premiers, Mr. McGuinty was nowhere to be found with his federal cousins to help us get that money back.
Mr. Harris, let me respond to this. Let me respond to that, Mr. Harris, because that is completely false.
This is about the fact that on top of those cuts by the federal Liberals, and I acknowledge them, because I experienced them too as part of the Ray government, but on top of those cuts, you went out and you cut more. You cut from hospitals. You set up a home care budget, which you froze at 1995 levels. You cut cancer care so that people are now having to go to the United States to get cancer care because you wouldn't fund the facilities that were already there and allocated.
Thank you, gentlemen, and that closes the health care issue, and we are now going to move on to the second videotaped question from a voter, and this time on the theme of education.
This is Chantal from Sudbury, and what I wanted to ask leaders was what kind of changes or cuts or improvements will they make to the elementary school system? Because this is a particular concern for me because my son will be in a pre-kindergarten this September.
Mike Harris, your response?
I'm sorry, I think I heard all of the question, and I'm sorry I missed your name. They were talking here, giving us all floor directions, and I apologize for that because I treat questions from the public very, very seriously. I think I heard you talk about junior kindergarten, and let me say there are 18,000 more children in junior kindergarten today than when we took office. We have guaranteed full funding for junior kindergarten and kindergarten to all school boards. And that has been consistent throughout our mandate. 69 out of 72 boards offer it. 3 others, primarily I think because they have other alternatives they think are better or because of geographic distances have offered other programs. But in addition to junior kindergarten and kindergarten, we are now going to act on Dr. Fraser Mustard's report, who says there's a lot more that can be done, not necessarily through the school system, but from birth through to age 3. We've invested a lot of dollars already in these areas. Now we want to follow Mustard's plan to do it all across the province.
Dalton McGuinty.
I think it's important for viewers to recall that 4 years ago, Mr. Harris said that he wouldn't touch education, that he wouldn't take 1 cent out of education. Well, we're short about $1 billion in education as a result of Mike Harris's cuts. Here's our plan for primary schools in Ontario. The first thing that we're going to do is stop the fighting and start focusing on learning. Mike Harris doesn't understand that we'll never bring the best out in our children unless we get the best out of our teachers. We want to make sure that the early years are smaller class sizes. That's important. I think everybody understands why we should do that today. We're going to bring 2,000 new computers every month into Ontario classrooms. We're going to make sure that parents have access to more information regarding what's going on inside the school, because one of the most important, if not the most important partner in education is the parent. We'll give them more information so they better understand what's going on inside the classroom and so they can help.
Howard Hampton.
I think we know the record. I think we know that Mr. Harris said 5 years ago that a recommendation for more early childhood education was the stupidest recommendation he'd ever seen. We then saw Mr. Harris cut 13 pilot projects across the province aimed at improving early childhood education. In fact, funding for JK and SK hasn't been guaranteed. I was at a school last week in Welland where parents were very upset because, in fact, the board has had to move from full-day senior kindergarten to half-day, simply because the funds aren't there. What's really happening is in many schools they have to decide, are we going to put resources into JK or SK, or are we going to put the resources into somewhere else? That's because there isn't enough money in the funding formula. You know, I wish we could fund schools adequately. I wish the money would appear out of the air, but I know that's not the case. I know that if we're going to have the funding, we have to roll back the top end of Mr. Harris's tax cut. At least $540 million of that has to go back into our schools to ensure that we can fund early childhood education, JK and SK, adequately.
Thank you. And our first question from our journalist panel comes from Colin Vaughan from City TV.
And it's to, good evening, gentlemen. I haven't had a chance to say that. It's to Mr. Hampton. And I want to get to the issue of education through an indirect route, through some of the issues raised in this campaign. Mr. Hampton, you went ballistic over reports of underage drinking and other supposed irregularities on a certain campaign bus in this election. You got tough and you called for police intervention. But your party has seemed soft on these sorts of issues. Your policies say nothing about school safety, or discipline in schools, or school uniforms, or young offenders. Which is the real Howard Hampton? The tough guy, hardball, or softball?
The real Howard Hampton is the person who supported a zero tolerance for violence in our schools over 6 years ago, when that was in fact implemented. It was a Howard Hampton who supported and voted for and provided for education against violence in the curriculum, which is the real way to deal with these things. It's the Howard Hampton who supports more resources for children's mental health. It's the Howard Hampton who supports more resources for early childhood education, because every study conducted in the Western world tells us that by supporting early childhood education, we have a chance to identify those children who have problems, and then we have a chance to remedy it at an early age. And if we don't do it then, it simply costs more money later on in the system and oftentimes becomes difficult. I called Mr. Harris to account for the fact that his campaign team rolled up to a school and tried to induce students to leave school, to skip school, and some of the inducements that were offered were improper too. I think on the face of it, there were breaches of the criminal law and perhaps 3 or 4 other laws as well. And I think everyone needs to be held accountable when that happens.
I think that particular incident is very telling when it comes right down to Mr. Harris's standards, but there's a story I'd like to relate to people watching this evening. In Kitchener-Waterloo, there was a grade 3 class that was sent out by the parents and teachers to sell chocolates on the doorstep, to knock on doors in the evening and sell chocolates. And they didn't do that because they were raising money for a school trip. They did that because they needed money to buy dictionaries and atlases. I think that's wrong. I think the education of our children, investing in our young people, should come before tax cuts. And our plan specifically provides that we will invest in health care and invest in education, and then we would balance the budget, and then and only then, without the necessity of having to go to foreign markets and borrow money, then we will provide tax cuts.
Well, Colin, I think the question had to do with respect and responsibility, and we've been very clear that we believe respect and responsibility needs not only to be taught in our schools, it needs to be demonstrated. We need to set good examples. We need to have zero tolerance, as Howard has indicated, but we also have to give teachers more authority to enforce those standards. We were going to have to take students right out of classrooms if they're disruptive, and that means we'll have to provide special programs for those students to ensure that they get an education, but they're not disrupting other children who get an education. And let me acknowledge, when somebody does something wrong, as the university students in my campaign did, we acted quickly. We said no, we said there are consequences, and they lost their whole program. You know, Dalton, when your campaign encouraged teachers to take whole classes out to hold your signs, you thought that was okay. You can't have it both ways, you see. You can't say it is wrong for me. It was. It was wrong for our campaign. We acknowledge that. We apologize. We fixed the problem. And then say, oh, but it's okay if they're cheering for liberals. You see, I think you're just listening to too many union leaders, and you're not talking to enough parents who who are telling me they like the changes in our school system. They're telling me they like the new curriculum. They like the new standardized tests. They like knowing where their schools stand. They like the idea that teachers should be tested as well to keep up to date. That's what real parents are telling me.
Mr. Harris, you're trying to avoid the real issue. The real issue here is that because you classify things like guidance, because you classify many of the school programs that are aimed at dealing with problems in the school, because you classify them as non-classroom spending, you have cut those resources. So the guidance resources aren't there. The resources in schools to make those interventions aren't there. The resources to help the students who need help, the resources for speech therapy, for children who need speech therapy aren't there. And when that doesn't happen, those children get lost in the system and then they start acting up. And your whole approach of strict discipline, of punishing people, doesn't deal with preventing the problem. It doesn't deal with helping people who need help. It's frankly putting the resources in the wrong place. If we invested in early childhood education, if we had those guidance resources in our schools, children wouldn't be acting up as much, and then you wouldn't have to rely so much on the punishment regime. I'm a parent.
But we need both.
I know that from working with my own children.
You would acknowledge we need both. You're for zero tolerance.
I'm for zero tolerance, but Mr. Harris, you've cut the resources. You've cut the resources at the front end, and that's going to create a worse problem down the road. And if I may say, and I still haven't had an answer to this, both you and Mr. McGuinty say you want to invest in education, you want to make these differences. But what you've put in place is an income tax system which has taken money out of our schools. And clearly that's the case. And I can't see how either of you are going to make those investments that are so necessary if you continue to support an income tax system which takes the money out.
I appreciate the question, but it's important to understand that an important component of our 2020 plan is a specific proposal that we create something that I call safe school zones everywhere in Ontario. Anybody who's caught dealing in drugs or carrying a knife or carrying a gun in or around a school will be slapped with an additional 2 years in sentence. We think it's important to send the message to young people and to society at large that we will not tolerate those kinds of things taking place near our schools. Now, one question that I have for Mr. Harris is, why is it that he has reduced the age in Ontario at which young people can carry a firearm from 14 to 12? I think that's a step, clearly a step in the wrong direction, Mr. Harris.
I'd be happy to answer the question because it is full of a substantial amount of misinformation. The viewers should know that. First of all, let me respond to your spending plan. It's a shopping list of $5.8 billion that is not costed for, and quite frankly, Howard is quite right. That means either you can't deliver, or you've got to run up the deficit, or you've got to hike taxes.
$2.5 billion.
12-year-olds,
If you read it, it's $2.5 billion.
No one is giving anyone a gun. This is an issue of safety. This is an issue of safe hunting practices. This is another example of you sensationalizing an issue and making allegations that, quite frankly, you know are not true. We are bringing our age in line with the federal legislation that permits 12-year-olds to carry guns. But we're saying, no, you're not going to do it. You won't do it in Ontario unless you take an approved course. And that is the same, and that is in line now with other provinces.
How did the two of you get from children's education to guns? That's what I'd like to know.
I think we're going to maybe find out at another time, because now we go to our next question from a journalist, from Jennifer Mossop on TV.
Thanks very much. My question is for Mr. Harris. You've made a lot of changes to the education system in the name of providing our children with a better education. There are many studies which indicate that one of the greatest obstacles between a child and a good education is hunger. And recent figures show that child poverty in Ontario has increased since you were elected. What are you going to do about Ontario children going to school hungry?
Well, Jennifer, it's a good question, and you're quite right. Amongst all the changes we've made to put more money into the classroom, to ensure that we stop the waste in bureaucracy, and that's why we reduced the administration, the number of boards, the number of trustees, the number of politicians. And the whole area of breakfast programs is an area that I championed when I was in opposition. And in the very first budget, even with an $11 billion deficit that we inherited, we put $5 million into breakfast programs to make sure that no child ever goes to school hungry. And there has been a rapid expansion of these programs all across the province. The other thing that we have done is we have cut taxes, particularly for low-income earners. We have now 300, close to 400,000 people off the welfare rolls. We have 545,000 people now working, and a good job is helping them and helping their parents alleviate this problem.
I can't understand how you can say that you've acted in the interest of Ontario children with a straight face. There are 500,000 children today growing up in poverty. Mine is the only party that is committed specifically to a benefit for children. You cut their welfare benefits by 22%. I think it's important that we ensure that children have what they need to get ahead in life, to get a good start in life. We specifically committed to a $250 million children's benefit to help children make sure that their parents have enough money for food for them, for shelter, and for clothing. If you were really committed to children, you would put their interests ahead of the tax cut.
Well, let me answer that, Howard, and then you come in. The tax cut was close to 50% for low-income Ontarians. The tax cut has given us the resources, the growth, the economy, that we can do a lot more for children, we can do a lot more for their parents, and we have many more of them working. It is the tax cut that's given us $6 billion and the growth and the jobs and the opposed and you opposed 69 of these tax cuts. Now you say they're okay.
I opposed borrowing for a tax cut, Mr. Harris.
You opposed 69 tax cuts. You voted no 69 times. Now in the election you say they're okay.
Now you've gone from children's poverty to a tax cut. Look, Mr. Harris, our economy has done well because the Americans are buying up all of our exports, because the Canadian dollar is so low that our products are now priced lower than ever. The only people who got a tax cut in this province are the 6% at the top. Lower income families, middle income families did not get a tax cut. They are overwhelmed by all of your new user fees, co-payment fees, higher property taxes, higher rent. But I want to just say, it's not just a question of food for children. It's also a question of housing. More and more children in this province are homeless or are at risk of becoming homeless. No one can organize their life if they don't have a roof over their head. You can't organize it for education. You can't organize it to get a job, to get training. And this is the shame of it. At a time when the American economy is booming and that wealth is overflowing into Ontario, we have the greatest increase in child poverty ever, and the largest increase in Canada is in Ontario. And we have more and more families with children who are becoming homeless. Why? Because Mike Harris has cut the things that families need. He did away with rent controls. Rents are going sky high. He says that the province is not going to be involved in providing affordable housing anymore. The private sector won't build it, so people can't get housing. Doing away with the shelter allowance has meant that families have to take money out of their food budget in order to pay their rent. This is wrong. Well, it's wrong. And Howard, we need to get back in the right direction. We need to say to those who've benefited at the top from Mike Harris's tax cut, it's time to put the money back where it will do the most good for the most people.
Let me acknowledge,
and the Democrats are committed to that.
Let me acknowledge you've said you would increase taxes, and you at least are costing your promises. Let me at least correct the record, because it's easy for both of you to make these allegations that you make. We are spending more than $2 billion in shelter subsidies. They've not been cut. They're growing. We are adding to them all the time. In response to the Golden Report, we're going to add yet another $50 million to shelter subsidies. We have put most of our new programs into children, Healthy Babies, Healthy Children programs. We've put it into tax credits of $1,000 now for low-income families for each child under 7.
Mr. Harris,
we have put more programs into
this is outrageous, sir.
Oh,
your so-called hostile allocation. What that does is it puts families with children in a one room in a hotel. And that one room in a hotel is more expensive than it would be to build affordable housing.
Well, Howard, you've made these allegations.
It is incredibly expensive. Well, go out. I've been out there. I've been out there to those shelters on Kingston Road.
Too.
And I've visited with those homeless families.
And so did I.
And the people who were there will tell you straight away that it costs more money to put families in that one little hotel room than it would cost to have a thoughtful program of affordable housing in this province, where we build the housing, low-income, not-for-profit housing, co-op housing, for families who do not have high incomes, because the private sector isn't doing it.
Can we just agree to this? You don't want to go back to the $5 billion housing boondoggle that the auditor said the program that was started under the Liberals and carried on with you. We did scrap that $5 billion boondoggle. And then when we had the Ann Golden report, the first government to come to the table was our government. The first government that committed to more money for housing, to more shelter subsidies, to more help was our government. The federal Liberal government, by the way, in Ottawa, which you've not been very good at talking to, hasn't come to the table yet with 1 red cent. They have this huge surplus, largely because they cut provinces. And even though we still haven't balanced our books, we're on track, we're ahead of schedule, we were the first government to come to the party and say, yes, we need to do more, but not the old boondoggle that wasted all the money.
The only thing that has changed during the past 4 years is that we are now closer to an election. That's the only thing that has changed. You have not been devoting any of your time, any of your energies, or any government resources to looking after people. That is the bottom line. You've been focused entirely on proceeding with a tax cut. You've borrowed $10 billion for a tax cut. You've added $24 billion to our debt. What kind of a legacy is that to leave to our children?
Mr. McGuinty, you agree with that tax cut. That's the problem.
Cut the debt faster.
You agree with that tax cut,
you say we could have cut the debt faster.
I'm saying you should not
can't have it both
borrowed
ways.
for a tax
You
cut.
cannot have it
Should not
both
have borrowed
ways.
for a tax
Thank you,
That's not
gentlemen.
leadership.
Thank you, gentlemen. And for our final question on the issue of education, Suhana Marchand.
I've been sitting listening for answers. I must listen more closely. My question is to Dalton McGuinty. Mr. McGuinty, you promise to repeal Bill 160, the government's education reforms. You say it's caused chaos for teachers, students, and parents. How will you undo Bill 160, and can you tonight guarantee that won't cause more chaos?
The reason that we have to undo Bill 160, Suhana, is because, quite simply, it's based on the understanding that the only way to deliver education in Ontario is from downtown Toronto in Queen's Park. I reject that notion. I think that the only way that we can possibly deliver quality education inside every classroom in the province of Ontario is by means of a good, solid, working relationship. The partners to that relationship are the government, trustees, teachers, and parents. Bill 160 places all authority over all education in the hands of the government. So now we've got a system in place that doesn't recognize unique features and characteristics. We're closing schools throughout the province of Ontario based on a funding formula that is complete nonsense. We're not respecting the needs of our communities. We've got cuts to special education, adult education, English as a second language, all because of Bill 160, which takes all power over all education and deposes that at Queen's Park. I think that's wrong.
Well, that's a nice speech, Dalton, but let me tell you that sitting in the Premier's chair has taught me that it's not quite that simple. Bill 160, Suhana, and that was your question, Bill 160 is a bill that for the first time said every child in Ontario will be funded equally. For the first time, low assessment boards, Northern Ontario boards, rural boards, Catholic boards get the same number of dollars as high assessment boards had. It's put fairness into the system. It's been applauded and lauded by all those low assessment boards as the first time this has ever happened. Secondly, Bill 160 takes away the right of school trustees to hike your taxes. The biggest tax increases we had were in residential property taxes for education. They more than doubled over a 10-year period. And what we have done is said, we will fund education, we'll stop the spiraling tax increases, we'll put more money into education as we are doing, and we'll do it in a fair way. And now that we've stopped the increase in property taxes, now we're going to cut property taxes with a 20% cut. Mr. McGuinty wants to hike property taxes 10%.
Mr. Harris,
he thinks that's fair.
This is not about property taxes, sir. This is about the fact that in your so-called funding formula, children who, for example, need a speech therapist can't get that speech therapist because the Board of Education has been forced to cut. I was in Kingston last week and met with a father who's facing up to your funding formula. The board used to have 6 speech therapists for autistic children like his. Now, because the funding formula is so inadequate, there's only 3 speech therapists for a much larger board. What you did, Mr. Harris, is you equalized down. You didn't bring the lower funded boards up. You brought the higher funded boards down, and then you took the money out of the system. And that is what is happening out there. That's why, for example, the Limestone Board of Education is cutting 50 special education assistants. That's why in board after board, special education is a very serious problem. That's why you got a letter from 4 Ottawa mothers who said, we would consider donating a kidney to the kidney dialysis program. It would save the province some money, but we'd want the money that's saved to go into special education. You've created a disastrous situation out there. And again, I say this to everyone who's watching. Mr. Harris has cut funding for education to finance an income tax cut. And neither he nor Mr. McGuinty is willing to put any of that money back into education. Mr. Harris wants to continue with tax cuts.
$975 million.
I'll give you a chance to respond. But here's what
Mike Harris. $975 million more than Mike Harris. If you read my plan, you would understand that is the specific commitment that I've made to education.
And I think it's important to either put up or shut up on this. Where are you going to find the money?
I think it's important that we restore funding for programs like English as a second language for new Canadians who are struggling to find success here. I think it's important that we have funding for junior kindergarten in every community in the province of Ontario. I think it's important that we have funding for special education. I had a group of parents who met with me in my constituency office. These are parents who have children who suffer from learning disabilities. They're making heroic efforts to give every possible opportunity to their kids, but their programs are being cut as a result of Mike Harris cutting funding to those kinds of essential opportunities in education in Ontario. I intend to restore funding for those programs.
Yeah. You've both talked. No, let me respond. You've both talked about. You've both accused me of cutting funding for education. Let me tell you. There is $600 million more in the classroom today, and let me acknowledge we cut some things. We cut bureaucracy, we cut school board politicians by 58%, we cut waste and duplication, we cut the school board's power to raise taxes, you both want to restore, and we cut out listening solely to the union bosses, and we decided we needed to listen to parents as well. And parents have told us the new funding formula is fair. The facts are special education money is the same or higher than it was before the funding formula came in. And the fact is that there is as much or more money and even more next year in the system than there was before. But we've asked them to spend it smarter. And we've asked them to cut out the bureaucracy and help get these dollars into the classroom to support the teacher. And teachers are now telling us, you know what? We're starting to see the benefit of the results. We like the new curriculum. We like the new report cards. We like the new standards. And parents are telling me this at every stop all across the province.
Mr. Harris, why then are 50 special education assistants being laid off at the Limestone Board? Why does a child in Kingston, an autistic child who needs speech therapy, why can't he get it? Why do we have reports from board after board after board of parents who cannot get the special education their children need, who special needs children? And I'll tell you why that's happening.
Oh,
because you have taken the money. And the question I have both for you and Mr. McGuinty, you say you want to put money into education, you say you want to make the investments. But as long as you're taking money out of our schools to fund an income tax cut that only benefits the well-off, neither of you is going to have the money. You can each make promises based upon a little bit of money that was put in the budget from the sale of Highway 407 this year. But this is an unsustainable situation. And neither of you is going to have the money because money will continue to be taken out of our schools, $4.1 billion a day to finance your income tax cuts.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And we now go to our third and final issue on the economy. Now, the question that you're going to hear from a voter is very brief, and perhaps if I could ask for any floor directions to be silent so that the leaders can clearly hear the question, if we could now hear the question.
My name is Dolores Dean. I live on Craven Road in Toronto. I'm a secretary, and I have a question for the Premier of the province. as a premier of a province with growing numbers of homeless people, what do you propose to do for the growing number of homeless people and for the growing numbers of people begging in the streets?
Now, even though the question is officially addressed to the Premier, it is addressed to all of you, and at this point it's Howard Hampton's turn, I believe, to respond first.
Yes, there are people living in the streets in Ontario, and the number of people who are at risk of becoming homeless is growing and growing. A study was released about 3 weeks ago that shows that we need 80,000 new apartment units, but the private sector is only going to build 6,000 over the next few years. So 74,000 more families are at risk of homelessness. Why has this happened? It's happened because the Harris government killed rent control. And that has allowed rents to rise dramatically. It's happened because affordable housing is not being built in this province. Mr. Harris ended that. It's happening because shelter allowance is not there. It's happening because at the same time that Mr. Harris has given a tax cut which benefits the well-off most of all, he has frozen the minimum wage for 4 years. So that people out there who work very hard for the minimum wage haven't received a pay increase. What needs to be done? And I say this to everyone. We can't continue to finance income tax cuts that benefit the well-off at the expense of the homeless, at the expense of our health care, at the expense of our education.
Thank
and
you.
Only New Democrats are prepared to roll that back and do something about it.
Dalton McGuinty.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. If I might speak directly to a question that has been raised by Mr. Hampton. This is a one-trick NDP pony. While Mr. Hampton believes that it's important to attack those with money, Mr. Harris believes that it's important to attack those without. I think it's time we start attacking our problems instead of attacking people. This is what we should be doing on the homeless front. First of all, we should be constructing 7,500 supportive housing units, as I've committed to doing. I think it's important to go ahead with our $250 million children's benefit commitment to help low-income families make sure their kids are getting everything they need to develop and grow properly. The other thing that the province can do is take a leadership position when it comes to ensuring that public housing is being built once again. I want to step up to the table and offer a rebate on PST on construction materials. I want to be able to say to municipalities, I need some land. I want to say to the federal government, why don't you do away with the GST? Let's work together and get some housing built.
Mike Harris?
Well, thank you very much. I think it was Dolores. It was hard to hear your name, Dolores, but it is a good question, and there is no question that even with a booming economy, and even with 540,000 more people working and 380,000 now off of welfare, because Toronto is booming in the last 4 years, we are a magnet for a lot of people. They're coming here. They're seeking jobs. They come from areas where there are not jobs, and we are getting more and more people showing up in Toronto looking for help, and we have to respond to this. We have committed, as Dalton says now, maybe he read our blueprint and read our response to the Golden Report, to PST reductions for low-income housing. We've offered government land. We are working and encouraging the federal government to come to the party with us and really respond to Golden's report in a meaningful way, in a way that not only is affordable, but in a way that will truly put the needs of the homeless first and help give them a job.
Thank you. And the first question in this final segment comes from Robert Fisher.
Thanks, Ann. Mr. McGuinty, my question is for you. We have discussed tonight the economy, healthcare, and education, just as the three of you have during this campaign, but let me suggest to you that one of the underlying issues in this campaign is leadership. Ontarians that I have spoken to want not only the tough decisions to be made, but the right ones. In light of that, if we could examine some of your record. As the new Liberal leader, one of your first acts was to try and put your brother on the Queen's Park payroll. You eventually backed off that. In the course of this election campaign, you have offered Ontarians an ambiguous plan with only vague promises about how to pay for it. You've appeared confused at times, both before the campaign and during the campaign, about your own health care and education numbers. And just last week, you were forced to offer what amounted to a half apology after suggesting that education budget cuts by the current government would result in situations, the terrible situations we've seen in Taber, Alberta, and in Littleton, Colorado. As a result of those examples and others, do you think you've demonstrated to Ontarians that you have the right stuff to be Premier of this province?
Thank you for your question, Robert. I want to make it perfectly clear that I make no claim to perfection, but I remain unwavering in my commitment to those things that Ontario families, absolutely have to be able to count on. People tell me all the time, I'm not asking for much, you know. The only two things that I want to be able to count on from my government are health care and education. I intend to ensure that Ontarians enjoy the same kinds of opportunities that I had growing up. We had health care that we could count on. If somebody had to be hospitalized, we knew that they'd be assessed quickly in the emergency ward. We knew that they could get a bed in the hospital. If somebody chose to go on to college or university, they could afford to do so. Today in Ontario, it costs $44,000 to become a doctor, $55,000 to become a dentist. When it comes to your health care and to your education, I'll make sure that those two things are there for you and that you can count on those.
Well, let me respond, Robert. It is leadership. I can tell you this, that being Premier the last 4 years, I've discovered there are no easy answers, and we will all make mistakes. We acknowledge that, and we will admit when we make mistakes, and we'll try and correct those mistakes as quickly as we can. But let me tell you that when it comes to leadership, part of that is saying what you mean and doing it. And when I have said I'm going to cut taxes 30%, I do it. When I say that I'm going to create 725,000 jobs, we're ahead of schedule to do that. When I said I'd bring in work for welfare, we did that. We have made the difficult but necessary decisions, and we have done what we said we would do, and I think that's an important part of leadership. And let me tell you some things that Dalton has said. He said when we brought in a law to repeal the job quota legislation that was on the books, Dalton voted in his party. They voted against that. Now he says, oh no, I'm opposed to quotas. I've changed my mind on the eve of an election. Tax cuts, he voted against 69 tax cuts. Now he says, well, I'll keep them. He said in March that you will not see tax cuts in my platform, he said. Now he's mentioning maybe there'll be tax cuts, although as Howard has ably pointed out, he's got close to $6 billion in uncosted spending that's there, and clearly he'll never get to that. It's issue after issue. Taxpayer Protection Act, he said, I don't believe in referendums. It wasn't in his book at all. And then after seeing the polling data, Dalton says, oh, maybe I'm for Harris's taxpayer protection after all. That is not leadership. And I will say, you want in, and before you come in, let me say, you at least have been consistent. You believe in higher taxes, Howard. I do not believe in higher taxes, but you have said you would increase taxes, and you've costed out your programs, and I acknowledge that you could actually balance the books in 2 years, whereas the Liberal platform will never balance them, but you will do so with fewer jobs.
Fine, Mr. Harris. Friends like that, I'd be careful. You've made your point. Now, I still have a point to raise with the two of you. It seems to me that leadership involves answering some very basic questions. And the basic question I have is this. Mr. Harris, you had to go out and you had to sell a highway this year in your budget year to give the appearance of filling in the holes and the cracks in healthcare. You've got one-time money of $1.6 billion. That means that next year there's a gap of $1.6 billion. And the year after that, because of population growth and so on, there will be a larger gap. Now, neither of you has answered the question here tonight. Where do you find the money? Are you going to sell another highway, Mr. Harris, or are you going to sell hospitals? And where's Mr. McGuinty going to sell the money? Because it seems to me that it clearly shows your tax cuts are unsustainable. When you have to start selling part of the province to find funding for health and education, it says to me that this is an unsustainable situation. Where are each of you going to find the money for your promises when most of the money is now going to finance your tax cuts, Mr. Harris?
Well, I appreciate the question because the debate is over. Tax cuts create jobs. You know, when we were elected, we inherited several deficits. We inherited this huge $11 billion annual deficit. We have dealt with that ahead of schedule. It's down to 2, and it'll be completely balanced next year. We'll be into surplus. But we also had high taxes, and we didn't have enough jobs. So we reduced the tax rates, and we increased the number of jobs and the number of people working. You know, would the leadership meant just dealing with one problem? We had the deficit, we had high taxes, we had a shortage of jobs to deal with, and we had to put more money into health care and education. We have done all of those things. I'd like to tell you, I'd like to tell you that I could have done more
The debate is over.
but that's
There's no doubt
what we have
about it.
done.
The debate is over. You squandered an opportunity. You squandered an opportunity. You went out to international markets and you borrowed $10 billion for a tax cut. All told, you've added $24 billion to our debt. That works out to 8,000 additional debt dollars for Ontario families. But what's worse, by so doing, you have compromised our ability to sustain quality health care and quality education. We're paying the price not only economically, but socially. Everybody today in Ontario knows that when it comes to our health care and our education, we are worse off today than we were 4 years ago, and that's because of your mismanagement, not only of the economy, but of health care and education.
Everybody knows. I'll give it back. Everybody knows. Everybody knows we've had the biggest, most miraculous turnaround. I'll answer your question. We've had the biggest turnaround in Canadian history, from last now to first, growing at double the rate of all the rest of Canada. That's given us the dollars to put $1.5 billion more in healthcare, $600 million more into classrooms in education, 540,000 new jobs. The record is clear. We have grown this economy because ours is a growth agenda. It's not a cut agenda. It's growing the economy, getting more people working, getting more Ontarians to the dignity of a job. And the record, and the economic record, is very clear that we have done that. And here is the deficit numbers: 11 billion down to 2 billion. That is a record that economists are saying is one of the greatest turnarounds in Canadian history. That's the record.
Nobody can cut like Mike Harris.
Thank you, and now we're going to go to our next question from Jennifer Mossop from On TV.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Hampton. We've just experienced one of the greatest periods of economic growth globally in quite some time. We've had lots of government spending cuts in Ontario. Still, the deficit has yet to be wiped out, despite Mr. Harris saying he was going to do that in his first term of office in the last debate. The debt has increased by more than $24 million since the last election. Now, Mr. Hampton, both your opponents profess to be committed to balanced budgets and to debt reduction. When would an NDP government balance the books and start tackling the debt?
By rolling back the top end of Mr. Harris's tax cut for the wealthiest 6% in the province, who get more than 25% of the money, we would have $1.5 billion to put into health care, education, protecting the environment, providing decent housing. And we'd be able to do that every year. That would enable us to tackle the very serious problems that are worrying so many of you across this province. And it would also ensure that we are making the right decisions so that we can balance the budget within 2 years. I can't say this more clearly for people. When a government has to go out and start selling off some of its real estate to make it look good in an election year, to make it look as if there's money for health care and education, it shows how unsustainable this track of tax cuts for the well-off really is. I know that the majority of you out there haven't had a tax cut, because whatever you were supposed to get from the income tax has been more than overwhelmed by increases in tuition fees, prescription medicine co-payment fees, and all the other things. It's only by rolling back the top end of the tax cut that we'll have the money to do what is really necessary for so many of us in Ontario.
Howard, clearly the record shows that 70% of the tax cuts, 70% are going to those earning $60,000 or less. 50% almost at the low end, 30% throughout, and less, of course, at the high end, because it was a progressive tax cut. And I want to address the issue of debt. This horrendous deficit of $11.2 billion was a deep hole to dig out of. The Red Book that the Liberals campaigned on said they'd add $18 billion to the debt before they could turn that Titanic around and get the books balanced. We said that we would add $19 billion to the debt. In actual fact, we're $5 billion better than that. $14 billion, not counting any hydro debt, has been added, and it will be still another billion or so until we get it turned. It was a deep hole. It was a horrendous problem, and if the deficit was the only problem, then maybe we could have balanced the books faster. But you know what? We had a deficit of jobs. We had a deficit of money in health care. We had a deficit of infrastructure, of schools. And now, with the Super Build Fund, which is where we've put the money from the highway, we're going to reinvest 200 new schools, $800 million into colleges and universities. So it's been a big challenge, but we've turned the corner. We're going in next year to a balanced budget exactly as we said we would do, because when I say we're going to balance the books in 5 years, we balance the books in 5 years.
Let's understand what really is meant by your tax cuts. You know, my favorite question for Ontarians is, so what have you done with your tax cut? You know what the usual reply is? What tax cut? What I do know is that my property taxes have gone up. What I do know is that we're now paying 60% increases in tuition fees for the kids. What I do know is that my mother is now paying user fees for her prescription. What we do know is that we're paying more to use the community center, maybe the arena, maybe to put the kids in soccer. So, Mr. Harris, it is pure, complete, absolute, and utter fiction to argue that your tax cut has in any real sense benefited people in their daily lives, because they have not experienced any net gain. In fact, they're behind today.
Let's look at the record. Property taxes went up record levels under your administration. Income taxes went up, but property taxes went up about 50%. They went up another 25% when Howard's government was in office. Let's look at Toronto, because this is the largest city. Property taxes in Toronto last year, 0 tax increase. This year, 0 tax increase. In fact, a tax cut, because we are lowering the portion of education taxes. So you can say those things if you want, but they're not true. The facts bear out that property taxes have been stabilized and now are going down. The facts are that income taxes have gone down, and what has been the result? We have 540,000 more people working. And I'd like to address those 540,000 Ontarians and their families. I want you to know something. We're glad you're working. We're glad you're paying taxes. You've contributed to this rising tide in Ontario. But I want you to know something else. The big spending promises of Dalton McGuinty threaten your jobs, they threaten the debt, they threaten more tax increases, and you cannot allow anybody to take away the gains that we have.
That's what we call fear-mongering, Mr. Harris. That's what we call fear-mongering.
That's what we call the facts.
It is beneath the dignity of the office of the Premier of Ontario. You know that I am committed to not raising taxes, and once I've eliminated the Mike Harris deficit, we won't be running deficits in the future. We have a responsible, balanced fiscal plan. It does the right things in the right order. First, we fix healthcare and education, because that's what people want us to do. Then we balance the budget, because again, that's the responsible thing to do. You have yet to balance the budget. We are on track in Ontario. People should understand. We are on track, as the Premier likes to say, we are on track to be the last province in Canada to balance our budget. Think of that.
Right, because we were the last province in Toronto to elect a government that thought the deficit was a problem.
I'm glad that the two of you have finally come out very clear about it. Mr. McGuinty, you've indicated you would not roll back any part of Mr. Harris's tax cut, despite the fact ordinary people, by your own admission, haven't had a tax cut. It is only people who are well off. You don't seem to be concerned at all about the health deficit. You don't seem to be concerned about the education deficit. Because if you were concerned about these things, I think you would acknowledge that we have to get our priorities straight. We can't be spending all our money funding tax cuts for the well-off. We have to be putting some of that money back into education, back into healthcare, back into protecting the environment. And you're not ready to do that, and Mr. Harris is not ready to do that. What I've heard here is Mike Harris 1 and Mike Harris 2. You both want to focus on a tax cut for the most well-off people in the province at the expense of healthcare, at the expense of education, at the expense that are most important for people across this province. That's what's gotten us into trouble. And talk about more tax cuts, and talk about sustaining those tax cuts is going to get us in more trouble still.
Thank you very much. And now for the very last question of the evening, Colin Vaughan from City TV.
Thank you very much. Let's get off the numbers game and let's get to economic style. I've been out and about with all three of you, and I've sort of talked to people after you've passed by, and I have heard a concern expressed in this province that, Mr. Harris, your policies are leading invariably and inevitably to the Americanization of Ontario's health and education systems. Will you give voters a commitment tonight that there will be no American-style HMOs or similar privatized healthcare services in Ontario if you're re-elected? And secondly, that there will be no American-style charter schools or school vouchers or anything like that if you're re-elected? Could we have a commitment, please?
Thanks very much, Colin, and I appreciate the question because my opponents have tried to allude to this. We've been very clear. First, with education, our priority is fixing the public education system. Our priority is to stop the deterioration in the public education system. I've been asked, would I support private schools? I went to the Jewish Congress. I said, no, I'm sorry, my priority is public education. Dalton, on the other hand, said, well, I'm not opposed to that. Howard has alleged private healthcare facilities. There are some private healthcare facilities, but the difference between the American system, there were under Howard, there were under Dalton, and they're still there now. The difference between the American-style system is it available only to certain people? We're committed to a universally accessible healthcare system in conformity with the Canada Health Act, and that's what we're rebuilding in this province, just as we're committed to full access to a public education system.
Nobody buys that. Nobody buys that, Mr. Harris. When it comes to education, there's been a 15%
out there. It's happening in terms of home care. It's happening in terms of long-term care.
15%
It's happening in terms of privatization of ambulance services. It's already, the privatization is already happening. The Harris government has cut services in hospitals. Those services are then moved out into the community. But the community services are not being provided by not-for-profit agencies. Those services are now being provided by private, for-profit healthcare corporations. Many of them American private, for-profit healthcare corporations. That's who's taking over home care and long-term care. The majority of the long-term care contracts awarded by the Harris government are to private, for-profit operators. Mr. Harris is piece by piece, through the back door, privatizing and Americanizing our healthcare system. And he may say that he's not doing it in hospitals, but by cutting the hospital services in the way that he's done, he's opened up all of the community sector to American-style, for-profit health care. And many of you, because I've talked to you, you know this. It's wrong. It's wrong. The Americans spend more money on health care than we do in Canada, and yet they leave close to 100 million Americans out of the system. And that's where we're headed. More user fees, more co-payment fees, more administrative fees. And we must stop this. And only New Democrats are prepared to stop it. And we need to put the money back in the system so we can stop it.
You've said you don't want the private sector to provide anything. I understand that. What is important is that if the private sector can provide a service more efficiently or more effectively, better quality, better price, we should let them do that in home care, and we are. Our hospitals, of course, are public and will stay that way with the exception of the Shouldice Clinic and some of these others that you all supported as well. What is the difference between American health care and Canadian is that every service, regardless of whether it's a private sector company providing home care or whether it's the VON or a not-for-profit or a for-profit, that they are universally available to every Ontarian in every community in this province. And we have added money to home care. We've increased it about 50%. We are bringing in new programs for the elderly. We have put more drugs available on the drug formulary than you guys did in the 10 years before we took office. And they are all universally accessible at the same way for everybody, whether you're rich or poor. And that, in fact, is our commitment, and that's the Canada Health Act.
What you are doing is much, much more insidious than simply standing here and saying, yes, I'm going to bring into place charter schools, and yes, I'm going to bring into place privatized health care.
Well, you said that.
Starving,
I didn't say
by
that.
Starving,
you
by
told
starving
the Jewish
public
Congress
health
you
care,
agreed with them.
By starving public health care.
And then you go into the public and say no.
Mr. Harris, you will know that is untrue. That is a fiction.
That's what they told me.
Well, what they said was, and what exactly happened was, I said that I'm not adverse to considering that. Let's talk about the privatization, growing privatization of health care and education in Ontario. You are cultivating that by starving the systems, both those systems, from cash. So we've got today in Ontario, during the past 4 years, a 15% increase in enrollment in private schools. And that's because parents feel, and I'm talking about struggling middle-class parents, they feel they can't get quality education in the system. They're tired of the fighting, they're tired of the bickering, and they want to find the best possible. I don't intend to cultivate that kind of appetite. What I intend to do is to make sure that parents can find the best quality education inside the public system. And I intend to do the same with respect to health care. I don't want Ontarians to say, I can't get quality health care within the public system, so I'm going to have to go elsewhere, or go to the States. I intend to support everything inside the public healthcare system, so families can have confidence in that.
We all agree with public education. Colin's question was, Mr. Harris, will you categorically guarantee that you're not going to support private schools? I said yes. I assumed you'd answer that question, and you said, oh no, I didn't say guaranteed I would, but I would consider it. I think that answers the question that Colin answered. We're all for better quality. Everything we've done is for improved quality education, new improved curriculum, more dollars into the classroom. And you have opposed us every step of the way. The new College of Teachers, mandatory teacher testing so they're up to date. You have opposed and you voted no for every quality move that we tried to make in the education. Why? Because the union leaders told you to oppose it. And you have to listen when you're Premier to all Ontarians, not just the union bosses.
What about students? Are they a special interest? Are sick people a special interest?
If you believe that you've improved the healthcare system by bringing in more private for-profit deliverers, then why is someone like a Veronica Manuel in Thunder Bay, why does she have to fight for her disabled child to get home care? Why does a Bernardo
Thank you, gentlemen.
Lenzi
We are
and Sault Ste.
now,
Marie
time
have
is
to do the
out
same?
on this final round, and I would now like to turn to the closing remarks. And as with the response to the voters' questions, there has been a draw to determine the order. Mike Harris, you go first.
Well, I'd like to thank you for tuning in tonight. 4 years ago, you told me to do the things that needed to be done to put Ontario back on track. We've turned welfare into work. Tax cuts have put more money in your pocket and have helped to create 540,000 new jobs. We've triggered the greatest economic turnaround in the country. We now have the means to afford the things we feel are important, like dependable health care and quality education. We have done what we said we would do. And while we've made a lot of progress, we have so much more to do. We offer a blueprint to keep our economy strong. Further tax cuts to create more jobs, including a 20% cut to provincial property taxes. Expanding work for welfare. Higher standards in education. Safer communities. In this election, you have a clear choice. Return to the days of high taxes and runaway deficits that expensive Liberal promises would surely bring, or join with us to keep our economy strong and keep Ontario on the right track. Thank you.
Howard Hampton.
In the short time that we've been debating tonight, over $250,000 will have been taken out of our hospitals and schools to finance Mr. Harris's income tax cuts. Income tax cuts which do not benefit lower and modest income families or even middle income families, which benefit the wealthiest people in this province. I say it is too great a price to pay to cut hospital care, health care, schools, and our communities to finance tax cuts which only benefit the well-off. Mike Harris isn't going to change that. He's indicated that. What was surprising is that Dalton McGuinty won't change it either. Mr. McGuinty agrees with Mr. Harris's tax cuts, even though our experience is that the money to finance them has come out of our schools and our hospitals. Mr. McGuinty wants to talk about investing in schools and hospitals, but if you agree with Mike Harris's unbalanced and unfair tax cuts, then we'll never have the money. What's clear is this. I have put forward a plan that shows how we could get $1.5 billion a year back into our schools, our hospitals, and our communities where it will do the most good for the most people. What we need is someone who is not just prepared to replace Mike Harris, but also replace the Mike Harris agenda, to put the money back where it will do the most good for the most people.
Thank you.
And that's what I'll do. Thank you.
Dalton McGuinty.
Thank you for watching tonight. This election is vitally important. Tonight, Mr. Harris has tried to convince all of us that he only did what he said he would do. Think about this. Did he say that he would cut and close our hospitals? Did he say that he would cut and close our schools? Did he say that he would borrow for a tax cut and add $24 billion to the debt that we're leaving our children? Because in fact, he did all of those things. I think it's time to put people first. As Premier, I will put our hospitals and our schools ahead of tax cuts. I will give you health care that you can count on so that we can treat our sick with the dignity they deserve. I will give you education that you can count on so that our children can enjoy the kinds of opportunities they need to find success. I know that we can do this if we just stop the fighting and start working together. I ask for your support.
Thank you, gentlemen. And that, of course, concludes tonight's debate. And now, of course, an avalanche of opinion will start pouring down on us on who won or didn't. But regardless of all that, its purpose was really quite straightforward. To give you, the viewers, who are the voters, a chance to find out just a little bit more about the important choice you have to make on June 3rd. Thank you to the leaders, to the journalists, to the voters who submitted questions, and thank you for being with us tonight. Good night.
And so with handshakes all around, the debate comes to an end. The formal debate is over, but the leaders are not through yet.